The USA and the USSR had emerged as two great post-war superpowers. When the Nazis attacked Russia in June 1941, both British Prime Minister Winston Churchill and USA President Franklin Roosevelt sent aid to the Soviets. This marked the beginning of the Grand Alliance. Welcome to my podcast about history. Today I am going to discuss about the beginnings of the Cold War, especially on the breakdowns of the Grand Alliance. For this, I would like to have two important guests that will help me to respond to the main question asked: why did the Cold War begin?
Okay, so the Cold War is a term used to describe a period of hostility and tensions between the USA and the USSR. Every action the USA took and the USSR took was seen as aggressive by the other side. So every action the USA took was seen by a threat by the USSR and vice versa.
So today I am Henry Kissinger and I will take the orthodox perspective that basically blames the USSR for causing the Cold War.
Hi, I am William Appleman and I will take a revisionist perspective, which basically blames the USA for being and causing the Cold War.
My name is John Lewis Gaddis and I will be supporting the post-revisionist perspective, which supports the fact that neither the USA or the USSR can be solely held responsible for the breakdown of the Grand Alliance and, by extension, the origins of the Cold War.
For beginning this podcast, I would like to say all the actions that the USSR made and the reasons why I hold the perspective of an Orthodox and why the USSR was the one who take all the blame. First, I would like to say Stalin's refusal to allow free elections in Eastern Europe. At the Yalta Conference held in 1945, Stalin had agreed to allow free elections in Eastern Europe. However, by 1947, it became evident that Stalin had no intention of honoring this promise. In countries like Czechoslovakia, Poland, Hungary, and the Soviet Union, actively suppressed democratic movements. For example, in Poland, Stalin manipulated the 1947 elections by ensuring that the Polish Workers' Party, the PWP, a communist group, gained dominance through intimidation and vote rigging. Reports estimate that 90% of opposition members were arrested or forced into exile, while the communist-controlled police suppressed dissent. This refusal to allow democratic governance ensured that these nations became one-party communist states under the Soviet influence by 1949.
I'm going to talk to you about the Truman Doctrine. While Henry points to Stalin's actions, the United States also played a key role in escalating the tensions with the Truman Doctrine. It was a clear shift in the United States foreign policy of isolation to have a new policy of containment of communism. The Soviets saw this evidence of determination of the United States to expand its sphere of influence, because Truman supported Greece and Turkey with economic and military aid, because Britain was no longer helping them. And they did not recognize any legitimacy in this new American involvement in Europe. For the Soviets, Truman exaggerated the threat of communism in his speech to the Congress in order to get them to support aid for Greece and Turkey.
Okay, both Mr. Kissinger and Mr. Appleman Williams raised valid points, but it is essential to consider the role of mutual mistrust and ideological disputes between the two nations. During and even before the alliance formed in the wartime period, both superpowers had a mistrust of the other side. Both the United States and the Soviet Union felt their way of life threatened by the other's system, which stemmed from their incompatible ideologies. And due to these conflicting ideologies, both nations always saw the other's actions through an ideological lens. So that is why the Soviet Union when we saw the actions made by the USA, such as the establishment of NATO as an aggressive action, leading to exaggerations and overestimations on both sides. Their conflicting ideological nature made it virtually impossible for them to remain allies for much longer. So this mistrust could be the cause for why, as Mr. Appleman said, why Truman exaggerated the threat of communism during his speech to Congress, which is due to this fear and mistrust which stem from their ideological differences, for which no other can have more blame than the other nation.
Another point that contributes, another factor, was the Soviet Union use of anti-Western propaganda. Anti-Western propaganda reached its peak in late 1940s and early 1950s. The Soviet Union depicted the United States as a capitalist aggressor bent on exploiting the working class. Soviet propaganda repeatedly highlighted events such as the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings that were in 1945, remember me? Yes. As evidence of the Western brutality and moral bankruptcy. In Eastern Europe, state-controlled media disseminated posters, films, and articles portraying the Marshall Plan that was held in 1947 as non-coalitionist project. For instance, statistics from 1949 revealed that 70% of the Soviet films produced were devoted to criticizing Western capitalists and military interventionists. This campaign intensified after the founding of the NATO, that was in 1949. Which was described as an imperialist military alliance designed to encircle and destroy socialism. Moreover, the presence of the Red Army, that was the army of the Soviets, in Eastern Europe was a direct result of the World War II military campaigns. By 1945, over 11 million Soviet troops occupied vast swaths of Central and Eastern Europe, including Germany, Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and also Czechoslovakia. The Soviet Union established permanent bases in these countries, ensuring compliance with Moscow directives. For instance, in East Germany, Soviet troops helped enforce land and reforms and industrial nationalization, while in Hungary, they played a key role in suppressing the 1947 opposition protests. By 1949, 2 years before, over 1.5 million Soviet troops were stationed in East Bloc, serving as both a secure measure and tool for enforcing the political loyalty to the USSR. So basically, the Soviet Union take all of the Eastern Europe countries and take military bases in their countries, so they felt like the Soviet Union was threatening them. So that's why I think the Soviet Union is the one with most fault for causing the Cold War.
Yet, the Marshall Plan itself was a reaction to Europe's economic devastation. The Soviets felt the United States was establishing a European empire, and that it was a method that was economic domination and dependence, which would ultimately give its political control. The United States intended them to not be part of it because the Americans had asked to see the receipts, the financial records, and they saw it as dollar imperialism. In the speech at the United Nations in 1947 by the Soviet Foreign Minister Andrew Vyshynski, he said that the United States tried to force its will on the other independent countries, whilst at the same time obviously using the money contributed as relief to needy countries as an instrument of political pressure. and that the implementation of the Marshall Plan will mean placing European countries under the economic and political control of the United States and direct interference by the latter in those countries. The U.S. actions with regard to the Marshall Plan were seen by the Soviets as capitalist interference, which meant that it was perceived as a tool to spread capitalist ideology and counter the influence of communism in Europe. And also, the aid of the Marshall Plan came with intention from the United States to promote free market, secure trades, and also open trades or open door policy that was in the late 19th century, which were characteristics of capitalist systems.
Okay, but USA was not only the causer of this. In response to the Marshall Plan, the Soviet Union launched the Molotov Plan in 1949 to provide economic assistance to Eastern Bloc countries. The plan aimed to strengthen economic ties within the socialist sphere, countering the influence of Western aid. Through the creation of the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, the COMECON, in January of 1949, the Soviet Union channeled resources to Allied states. Between 1949 and 1951, COMECON distributed approximately, I think that was 4 billion in aid to Eastern Bloc nations, focusing on industrial reconstruction in Poland, Czechoslovakia, and also in Hungary. This plan ensured these countries remain economically dependent on Moscow, that was the capital of USSR, solidifying Soviet influence in the region. So I think that everything that Stalin made was overthought by him. He knows all his movements, he knows all the consequences that his movements will cause, and he's a very intelligent man. So I think that the Molotov Plan was a response and like a copy of the Marshall Plan by United States. So United States was not the one who blamed this situation, because the Molotov Plan was his reaction and his concrete action of the Marshall Plan. Did you know how cut salami piece by piece? The Soviet Union salami tactics in Eastern Europe clearly demonstrate their own aggressive solidification of power. Salami tactics were employed effectively between 1945 and 1948 to consolidate communist control in Eastern Europe. For example, in Hungary, the Soviet-backed Communist Party systematically eliminated opposition parties, cutting the piece of the salami. Between 1946 and 1947, coalition parties were gradually infiltrated, their leaders arrested, and their influence neutralized. By 1948, the Hungarian Communist Party had absorbed its rivals, forming the Hungarian Working People's Party, which became the ruling force. Similar process occurred in Czechoslovakia, culminating in 1948. Communist coup, where the communists used intimidation and purge to consolidate power. A year later, in 1949, all Eastern Bloc countries had fallen under Soviet control, demonstrating the effectiveness of this incremental approach. You know how to cut the salami piece by piece. That's how Stalin secured to his influence. I don't like this because I think that he cut piece by piece the people and removed the people. He did not change their minds to have the same point of view like him. He only, if you have a mind of opposition to the government, he eliminates you by killing you. So I don't think that that's the way to change their perspectives.
But Henry, The US implementation of the Marshall Plan also involved strict conditions that the USSR could never accept, such as financial transparency. This was another form of dollar imperialism. The United States did not want the USSR to join the Marshall Plan, but they did not want to exclude them or avoid them. So they solved this problem by setting down strict criteria to be qualified to have the help of the Marshall Plan and the American economic aid. This involved allowing the United States to investigate the financial records of the applicant country, in this case, the Soviet Union. The USSR would never tolerate this condition. To Stalin, the United States' pursuit of the world's markets looked like dollar imperialism. The US setting up economic spheres of influence that were based on its own capitalist aims, and which also promoted American interests in general.
Moreover, the salami tactics implemented by the USSR and the so-called dollar imperialism made by the economic interests of the USA can be seen as both of them having expansionist by nature. The USA, starting from 1857 with the purchase of Baker Island, began expanding overseas. Russia, on the other hand, is quite literally the biggest territory in the world, and it only became larger and more powerful as it grew with the creation of the Soviet Union. But even before that, the Russian Empire was the largest empire in history at its peak in the late 18th century and early 19th century. So both countries were constantly in the middle of conflict in order to expand, whether that is overseas or in another continent. In the case of the Russian Empire, they expanded and conquered other countries, making them their own. And this only incremented with the creation of the Soviet Union in 1917. So what I can gather from both of your perspectives is that both the USSR and the USA had expansionist desires. So that could be another reason for the breakdown of Soviet-American relationships, is because of their historical rivalry. Much before the Bolshevik Revolution, the great nations had global power and great influence, even with the 19th century. The Russians have a long history of being in conflict and invaded by neighboring countries, especially from the West. So the USA and Russia have fought each other during the Russian Civil War in 1917, which the Russians with the Red Army and the Americans fighting with the White Army. So historically, the USA and the USSR have been fighting each other, whether that is ideologically with the beginning of the 20th century and for other expansionist reasons before the Bolshevik Revolution. So even before the USSR formed itself, Russia and America had different aims, which made them fundamentally incompatible for them to have an alliance for a long period of time.
To summarize, from my perspective, the revisionist, the United States is significantly responsible for the outbreak and escalation of the Cold War. The United States' foreign policy during the early Cold War contributed significantly to the rising tensions between the two superpowers, who were the USSR and the United States. The Truman Doctrine marked a decisive shift from isolation to the containment of communism, framed as a fight against the spread of communism, but perceived by the Soviets as an attempt to extend the US influence in Europe and also the Mediterranean. Similarly, the Marshall Plan, though apparently aimed at European economic recovery, was seen by the USSR as a strategy of dollar imperialism, using economic dependence to establish capitalist dominance and secure political control over recipient nations. The insistence on financial transparency and the exclusionary criteria set for participation in the Marshall Plan solidified Soviet suspicions of American intentions to the Soviets, these policies exemplified the United States' pursuit of global economic dominance and its interference in the sovereignty of other nations. By promoting free market system, the U.S. sought to secure open trades and routes and also prevent economic expansion, aligning with its broader geopolitical interest. These actions were interpreted by the Soviets as capitalist intrusion and a direct threat to communist ideology.
The post-revisionist school of thought holds the idea that neither the USA nor the USSR can be attributed the full blame for the breakdown of the Grand Alliance. Fellow historian Ernest May supports this view by stating that the early Soviet Union was ruled by a paranoid leader who saw expansion into Eastern Europe as a necessity for survival. The United States government responded to this by focusing on military strength and adopting a foreign policy based on containment and a nuclear deterrent. With this insight, we can see the action-reaction nature of the early Cold War diplomacy, and thus reaching the conclusion that both superpowers carry some blame. However, some of it is due to external factors which were not entirely in their control.